Captain Brian Donovan knelt on the red clay of Firebase Mackie, March 18, 1971, holding something that shouldn't exist, a fragmentation grenade pin with Sergeant Miller's blood on it, the monsoon rain mixed with mud. 15 feet away, Miller's body lay against the sandbag wall of the command bunker. The explosion had come from inside the perimeter, not a mortar, not a rocket, a grenade, American issue, M26 fragmentation. Donovan's hands shook as he stared at the pin. His sergeant hadn't been killed by the Viet Cong. He'd been murdered by someone in his own unit, someone who slept 30 feet away, someone who ate breakfast with them that morning. In that moment, staring at that pin, Donovan realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The United States Army wasn't just fighting the enemy anymore. It was fighting itself, and it was losing both wars. This is the story of fragging, the epidemic of soldiers murdering their own leaders that nearly destroyed the American military. Over 900 documented incidents between 1969 and 1972. Hundreds more suspected but never proven. Officers sleeping in body armor, NCOs carrying pistols inside their own bases, entire units that refused to fight. But to understand how America's military collapsed from within, we must go back to when everything still made sense. Back to 1965, when Captain Donovan first arrived in Vietnam, and the U.S. Army believed it was building something exceptional. Brian Donovan graduated from West Point in 1963, class of '63, the same year John F. Kennedy was assassinated. He volunteered for Vietnam in 1965, when American troop numbers stood at just 23,000 advisors. The war was still small, still manageable, still winnable. His first unit was Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, elite paratroopers, professional soldiers, men who'd chosen to be there. And at first, it worked exactly as doctrine promised. Donovan's company operated in the Central Highlands near Pleiku. Their mission: search and destroy. Find the enemy, fix them in place, call in artillery and air support, eliminate them. The American military machine at its finest. In his first 6 months, Donovan participated in 11 combat operations. His unit took casualties, 3 killed, 14 wounded, but they inflicted far heavier losses on the Viet Cong. The body count reports told a clear story. America was winning. His men were motivated, disciplined. They followed orders without question. When Donovan said move, they moved. When he said assault, they assaulted. This was how armies were supposed to function. Lieutenant James McCarthy, serving in the same brigade, wrote home in December 1965. "These are the finest soldiers I've ever served with. Professional, committed. They believe in the mission." McCarthy would survive Vietnam and later testify before Congress. In 1985, in a filmed interview, he reflected on those early days. "We had no idea what was coming. We thought discipline was permanent. We thought morale was something you just maintained through good leadership. We were wrong." But in 1965, McCarthy didn't know that yet. None of them did. The indicators all pointed toward success. The 101st Airborne maintained a 97% operational readiness rate. Desertion rates were negligible, less than 2% annually. Drug use was minimal, mostly marijuana, easily contained. Courts-martial for serious offenses, fewer than 1 per 1,000 soldiers monthly. These weren't conscripts, these were volunteers, men who'd raised their right hand and sworn an oath, the backbone of any military, willing fighters. Donovan rotated home in late 1966, promoted to captain. He'd done everything right, led men in combat, earned their respect, completed his tour. He received the Bronze Star for valor during an engagement near Dak, to where his platoon held off a larger enemy force for 6 hours. The Army sent him to the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he trained the next generation of officers. He taught small unit tactics, leadership under fire, how to maintain discipline in combat. He believed in every word. In 1968, the Army asked him to return to Vietnam. The war was expanding. They needed experienced combat leaders. Donovan accepted. He thought he knew what to expect. He was catastrophically wrong. When Captain Donovan landed at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in August 1968, Vietnam was a different war. American troop strength had exploded to 536,000 soldiers. The Tet Offensive 6 months earlier had shattered the illusion of imminent victory. And something else had changed, something harder to quantify: the draft. By 1968, fewer than 30% of soldiers in Vietnam were volunteers. The rest were conscripts, men who'd been drafted, who'd never chosen to be there, who'd been pulled from college campuses, factory jobs, and family farms by a system they increasingly saw as unjust. Donovan noticed the difference immediately. His new unit, Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, looked nothing like the paratroopers he'd led in 1965. The men were younger. Many were 19, 20 years old. They wore peace symbols on their helmets. They questioned orders. Not with insubordination, not yet, but with a kind of exhausted skepticism that Donovan had never encountered before. On his 3rd day with the unit, during a patrol briefing, a specialist named Rodriguez asked, "Sir, what's the objective?" Donovan explained, "We're clearing this sector, denying the enemy freedom of movement." Rodriguez stared at him. "We cleared this sector 2 months ago. Why are we clearing it again?" The question hung in the humid air. Donovan didn't have a good answer, because it was on the operations order, because battalion said so, because that's what the strategy required: constant pressure, denying the enemy rest. But Rodriguez's question revealed something deeper. These men didn't believe anymore. They'd seen the same villages cleared 5 times. They'd watched territory seized and then abandoned. They'd counted bodies that didn't seem to matter because the enemy always returned. Still, they followed orders. Reluctantly, slowly, but they followed. The first 6 months of Donovan's second tour were tense but manageable. His company conducted operations, engaged the enemy, took casualties: 3 killed, 19 wounded, acceptable losses by military standards. But Donovan started noticing small fractures. Marijuana use was no longer occasional. It was epidemic. He estimated 60% of his company smoked regularly. Heroin began appearing, pure, cheap, readily available. Soldiers would buy it in Saigon on R&R and bring it back to base. Discipline problems increased, men showing up late to formation, equipment not maintained properly, small acts of defiance that, individually, seemed manageable but collectively revealed erosion. In January 1969, Donovan's company refused an order, not openly, not with mutiny, but with a tactic that became devastatingly common. They simply moved so slowly that the mission became impossible. Ordered to advance 2 kilometers and establish a blocking position, they took 6 hours to move 800 meters. By the time they arrived, the enemy had vanished. Donovan confronted his platoon leaders. They shrugged. "The men are tired, sir. We're moving as fast as we can." It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. But what could Donovan do? Court-martial the entire company? The first fragging incident that Brian Donovan personally encountered happened on February 23, 1969. Lieutenant William Patterson, a platoon leader in Donovan's company, was sleeping in his hooch, a wooden structure with a corrugated metal roof at Firebase Bastogne. At 2:17 a.m., someone rolled a fragmentation grenade under his bunk. The explosion destroyed the hooch. Patterson survived, but lost his right leg below the knee and suffered severe shrapnel wounds to his abdomen and chest. He was medevaced to Japan and eventually returned to the United States. The Criminal Investigation Division arrived. They interviewed everyone. They found nothing. No witnesses, no evidence, no motive they could prove. But every soldier in that company knew exactly what happened and why. Patterson had been pushing his men hard: aggressive patrols, strict discipline. He'd written up 3 soldiers for marijuana possession the week before. He'd threatened courts-martial. He'd told his platoon they were lazy, undisciplined, disgraceful. Someone decided to solve the problem permanently. The grenade was never traced. The pin was never found. The CID investigation closed as unsolved. But the message was clear. Officers who pushed too hard might not wake up the next morning. Donovan held a company formation the next day. He tried to address what happened without directly accusing anyone. "Lieutenant Patterson was a good officer," he said. "What happened to him was a tragedy. We need to work together. We need to trust each other." A voice from the back ranks: "Maybe he shouldn't have been such an asshole, sir." Laughter rippled through the formation. Donovan stared at his company. These were his soldiers, his responsibility, men he was supposed to lead, and they were laughing at an attempted murder of one of their own officers. That's when Donovan first realized. He was losing control, not just him, every officer, every NCO. The entire chain of command was losing its grip on the fundamental requirement of military service, obedience. Over the next 6 months, Donovan watched the situation deteriorate with geometric acceleration. In March 1969, 2 more fragging incidents occurred in his battalion. One killed a staff sergeant who'd been strict about guard duty. One injured a first sergeant who'd conducted surprise inspections of living quarters. In April, 3 incidents, May 4, June 7. The Army began keeping statistics. In 1969, there were 96 confirmed fragging incidents across all of Vietnam. In 1970, that number jumped to 209. In 1971, it would reach 333. But those were just the confirmed cases. Explosions where investigation determined the grenade came from within the unit. The actual number was certainly higher. Some fraggings were disguised as combat deaths. Some were attempts that didn't kill anyone. Some were never reported at all. Captain Thomas Conklin, serving with the 25th Infantry Division, later testified, "We stopped sleeping in our assigned quarters. Officers and senior NCOs would rotate sleeping locations randomly. We wore body armor inside the base. We kept pistols loaded next to our beds, not because of the enemy, because of our own soldiers." But fragging was just the most visible symptom of a deeper collapse. The real crisis was something far more insidious: combat refusal. In August 1969, Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 196th Light Infantry Brigade, received an order to advance into a heavily fortified enemy position in the Cohesion Valley. The company commander, Captain Richard Thompson, briefed the mission. His men listened silently. Then they refused. Not with shouting, not with violence. They simply said, "We're not going." Thompson was stunned. "That's a direct order." The sergeant replied, "We understand, sir. We're still not going." Thompson threatened courts-martial. The men shrugged. What was the Army going to do? Court-martial 140 soldiers simultaneously? Send them to prison? They'd be safer in a military prison than in the Cohesion Valley. Thompson radioed battalion. Battalion radioed brigade. Brigade contacted division. The standoff lasted 4 hours. Finally, division sent a different company. Alpha Company faced no courts-martial, no punishment, because the Army realized something terrifying. If they prosecuted these men, hundreds of other units might refuse too. The facade of control had to be maintained. The incident was never officially reported. It appeared in no newspapers. No congressional hearing examined it. But every officer in Vietnam heard about it within a week. Brian Donovan heard about it from another captain over drinks at the officers' club. "They just refused?" Donovan asked. "And nothing happened?" "Nothing happened," his friend confirmed, "because what could happen? We don't have enough military prisons to hold everyone who doesn't want to fight anymore." Donovan sat in silence, his beer growing warm in his hand. He thought about his own company. Could they refuse? Would they refuse? The answer was, probably, and there was nothing he could do about it. The drug epidemic accelerated the collapse. By 1970, estimates suggested 35,000 American soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin regularly. Not occasionally, regularly, daily. Donovan watched his own men deteriorate. They'd returned from Saigon after 3-day passes, glassy-eyed, lethargic, barely functional. He'd order drug tests. The tests would come back positive. He'd send the paperwork up the chain of command. Nothing would happen, because if the Army discharged everyone who tested positive for drugs, they'd lose a quarter of their force. The machine couldn't function without bodies. So the Army looked the other way. Officers pretended not to notice. NCOs stopped enforcing standards. The entire system adapted to dysfunction because dysfunction had become the only way to maintain minimal operational capacity. First Sergeant Robert Vale, who served with the 1st Cavalry Division, described it in a 1987 interview. "We had formations where half the men were high. We'd conduct inspections where weapons weren't cleaned, equipment was missing, uniforms were filthy. And we'd pass them anyway, because if we held actual standards, nobody would pass. The choice was between pretending we had an army or admitting we didn't. We chose to pretend. But the pretense was becoming impossible to maintain. The underground press was the final accelerant. Starting in 1969, soldiers began publishing unauthorized newspapers with names like FTA, common soldier slang for an obscene phrase about the Army, About Face, The Last Harass, and Shakedown. These weren't professional publications, they were mimeographed sheets, photocopied and distributed hand-to-hand. But their impact was devastating. They published articles calling officers murderers. They printed tips for avoiding dangerous patrols. They explained legal strategies for refusing orders. Some openly advocated violence against the chain of command. An article in The Bond published in 1970 stated, "If your officer is leading you into a suicidal situation, you have the right to defend yourself by any means necessary." This wasn't anti-war sentiment from civilian protesters. This was coming from inside the Army, from soldiers in Vietnam, from men with access to weapons. Colonel Robert Heinl, a Marine officer, wrote an article in 1971 titled "The Collapse of the Armed Forces" that was published in Armed Forces Journal. His assessment was brutal. The morale, discipline, and battle-worthiness of the U.S. Armed Forces are, with a few salient exceptions, lower and worse than at any time in this century and possibly in the history of the United States. Heinl documented the crisis with devastating statistics. By 1971, desertion rates exceeded 70 per 1,000 soldiers annually. Absent without leave rates were even higher. In 1970 alone, 65,143 soldiers deserted. That's 180 soldiers per day abandoning the military. But here's what made it worse. Many of them weren't even fleeing to Canada or Sweden. They were simply disappearing into Saigon, into the chaos of Vietnam's cities, living in the underground economy, supported by networks of other deserters. The Army didn't even attempt to find them all. There were too many. Brian Donovan's personal turning point came on March 18, 1971, the incident at Firebase Mackie that opened this story. Sergeant Miller had been a traditional NCO, 38 years old, career soldier, enlisted in 1954, served in Korea. He believed in discipline, standards, the old Army way. He'd been cracking down on drug use in his platoon, conducting surprise inspections, confronting soldiers who were high on duty. He'd written up reports, recommended Article 15 punishments, pushed for courts-martial. The men hated him. They called him lifer behind his back. Derogatory slang for career soldiers. They saw him as a relic, an enforcer for a system they'd rejected. Someone decided Miller had to go. The grenade came through the window of the command bunker at 11:47 p.m. Miller was sitting at a desk writing reports. The explosion killed him instantly. Donovan had been in his own hooch 50 feet away. He heard the blast, grabbed his rifle, ran toward the bunker. Other soldiers emerged from their positions, moving slowly, without urgency. When Donovan reached the bunker, Miller was already dead. The grenade pin lay on the floor, blown clear by the explosion. Donovan picked it up, smooth metal, still warm. He looked around at the soldiers gathering. They stared back at him. No shock, no horror, just tired indifference. Someone had just murdered a sergeant in front of everyone on an American military base, and nobody was going to say anything. The CID investigation took 3 weeks. They interviewed 140 soldiers. Every single one claimed they saw nothing, heard nothing beyond the explosion itself, knew nothing about who might have done it or why. The investigation closed unsolved, like hundreds of others. But Donovan knew. Everyone knew. The unit had killed Miller because he represented something they'd rejected: authority. That's when Donovan asked himself the question that changed everything. What if we've already lost? Not lost the war against North Vietnam. Lost something deeper, the ability to function as a military at all. What if the fraggings, the refusals, the drugs, the desertions, what if those weren't problems to be solved? What if they were symptoms of complete systemic collapse? Donovan started looking at the numbers differently, not as individual incidents, but as a pattern revealing something fundamental. In 1970, the Army conducted 213,000 courts-martial. In a force of 1.3 million soldiers, that's 1 in 6 facing military justice charges annually. The system was spending more energy prosecuting its own soldiers than fighting the enemy. In 1971, the Army reported 107 attacks on officers with explosive devices, but attacks with other weapons, rifles, knives, blunt objects, were far more common and rarely documented. Estimates suggested that for every fragging, there were 5 to 10 other violent incidents between soldiers and their leaders. Major General Robert Guard, who served in Vietnam and later became a senior Army officer, reflected in a 2005 interview. "We had units that were combat ineffective, not because of enemy action, but because of internal breakdown. Platoons where men wouldn't follow orders, companies where officers couldn't sleep safely, battalions where the only thing holding them together was the countdown calendar until people rotated home." The Army's response was to shorten the tour length. In 1969, they reduced the standard Vietnam tour from 18 months to 12 months. The logic was that shorter tours would improve morale. It had the opposite effect. Now, soldiers arrived in Vietnam thinking only about survival, not victory, not mission accomplishment, just staying alive for 365 days and going home. This created the short-timer phenomenon. Soldiers in their last 2 months became nearly useless. They refused dangerous assignments. They hid during combat. They counted days obsessively. Units would have 20–30% of their strength classified as short-timers who couldn't be relied upon for anything beyond basic guard duty. And the one-year tour destroyed unit cohesion. In World War II, units trained together, deployed together, fought together, and returned together. They developed bonds that held through the worst combat. In Vietnam, individuals rotated through units on their own schedules. A soldier would arrive at a unit, spend 365 days, and leave, while everyone else's timelines overlapped chaotically. There was no unit in any meaningful sense, just a collection of individuals serving separate sentences. Donovan saw this in his own company. Men would arrive, and he'd learn their names, and 6 months later, they'd be gone. New men would arrive. The faces changed constantly. There was no continuity, no shared history, no reason to build trust when everyone was temporary. Captain Robert Foote, who served with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, described it, "We weren't a company. We were a bus station. People arrived, they waited, they left. Nobody formed real bonds because why invest emotionally in someone who will be gone in 8 months? The Army destroyed its own cohesion with that policy." But it gets worse. The policy of rotating individuals, not units, meant experienced soldiers were constantly being pulled out and replaced with new arrivals who knew nothing. A platoon might lose its best fire team leader just as his replacement, fresh from the United States, no combat experience, showed up. This created a death spiral. New soldiers made mistakes. Those mistakes got people killed. Survivors blamed the new guys. New guys blamed the system. Everyone became more cynical, more focused on personal survival, more willing to refuse orders that seemed risky. By 1971, some units had become what one officer called armed camps of hostile strangers. Men who didn't know each other, didn't trust each other, didn't want to be there, forced to operate together in combat. It was a recipe for catastrophe. The most devastating evidence came from enemy assessments. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong intelligence reports, captured and translated after the war, revealed that they understood American military collapse better than American leaders did. A 1971 North Vietnamese intelligence report stated, "American unit cohesion has deteriorated to the point where many formations are combat ineffective. Their soldiers are unwilling to engage. Their officers are afraid of their own men. We should increase pressure to accelerate this collapse." They were right. The North Vietnamese noticed that American units would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid combat. Units would conduct reconnaissance by fire, shooting randomly into jungle without targets, to create the impression of enemy contact so they could withdraw without actually engaging. Some units developed search and avoid tactics, deliberately making noise on patrols so any enemy forces would flee before contact. The goal wasn't to find the enemy. It was to avoid finding them while still completing the patrol requirement. This wasn't cowardice. This was rational self-preservation by men who'd stopped believing the mission mattered. Donovan watched his own unit do this. On a patrol in April 1971, his platoon leader radioed back, "We've found signs of enemy presence. Request permission to withdraw and call in artillery." Donovan asked, "What signs?" "Footprints, sir. Old fighting positions. Definitely enemy activity." The footprints could have been water buffalo tracks. The fighting positions could have been from a battle months earlier. But Donovan approved the withdrawal, because he knew if he ordered them forward, they might refuse. Or they might go forward but move so slowly that any actual enemy would vanish. Or they might simply shoot him. So he let them withdraw. He called in artillery on an empty hillside. He wrote a report claiming successful disruption of enemy movements. Everyone pretended the mission had meaning. This was the reality of command in 1971, managing dysfunction, not leading soldiers. The final piece of Donovan's realization came from a conversation with a chaplain in May 1971. Captain Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest assigned to the brigade, found Donovan sitting alone after another fragging incident, this one injuring a company commander. O'Brien sat down. "How are you holding up?" Donovan stared at his hands. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Father. I don't know how to lead men who don't want to be led." O'Brien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You can't lead them, not really. Because leadership requires consent. It requires the led to grant authority to the leader. These men have withdrawn consent, not just from you, from the entire system. So what do I do? You survive. You keep as many of them alive as possible. You wait for this to end. That's all you can do." Donovan realized O'Brien was right. The war, the real war, the one that mattered, wasn't against the North Vietnamese. It was against entropy, against the disintegration of the army itself. And that war was already lost. The numbers confirmed it. In 1971, American combat deaths in Vietnam, 357. American soldiers who died from non-combat causes, accidents, drug overdoses, murders by fellow soldiers, 1,643. The Army was almost as dangerous to itself as the enemy was. Brian Donovan rotated home from Vietnam in September 1971. He was promoted to major. The Army offered him a position at Fort Leavenworth, teaching tactics at the Command and General Staff College. He resigned his commission 3 months later. In a letter to his former battalion commander, written in 1972 and later archived at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, Donovan explained his decision. "I joined the Army because I believed in service, in sacrifice, in leading soldiers who wanted to be led. What I experienced in Vietnam wasn't leadership. It was crisis management of a system destroying itself. I can't teach tactics when the real lesson is that morale matters more than tactics, and we broke our own morale through policies designed to ignore human limits." Donovan wasn't alone. Between 1971 and 1973, the Army experienced what one historian called a hemorrhage of junior officers. Captains and majors, the combat-experienced core of any army, resigned in massive numbers. The Army's officer corps shrank by 30,000 positions between 1970 and 1974. West Point graduation numbers dropped. ROTC programs at major universities shut down due to anti-war protests and lack of interest. The Army that emerged from Vietnam was broken. It would take more than a decade to rebuild. But here's what makes this story matter. The collapse wasn't caused by battlefield defeats. The United States military won virtually every tactical engagement in Vietnam. The Army was destroyed by psychological forces, lack of purpose, absence of clear objectives, and policies that treated soldiers as interchangeable units rather than humans. General Crichton Abrams, who became Army Chief of Staff after Vietnam, led the rebuilding effort. His insight was simple but profound. An army is not a machine, it's a human organization. And human organizations require shared purpose, mutual trust, and leaders who genuinely care about the people they lead. The post-Vietnam Army made fundamental changes. They eliminated the draft, creating an all-volunteer force. They stopped individual rotations, returning to unit-based deployments. They emphasized small unit cohesion, training companies and platoons together for months before deployment. They took drug abuse seriously, implementing mandatory testing and rehabilitation programs. Most importantly, they recognized that morale isn't a luxury. It's the foundation of military power. The fragging epidemic ended not because the Army prosecuted the perpetrators. They couldn't, there were too many. But because the Army withdrew from Vietnam and reconstituted itself around soldiers who wanted to be there. So what's the lesson? What does Vietnam's psychological collapse teach us beyond military history? The lesson is this: systems cannot function when the humans inside them withdraw consent. Doesn't matter how powerful the system, doesn't matter how sophisticated the technology, doesn't matter how clear the chain of command. When people stop believing, the system breaks. This applies to corporations. When employees stop believing in a company's mission, productivity collapses, talent leaves. Those who remain do the minimum. Management issues orders that are quietly ignored. The company continues to exist on paper, but it's already dead. This applies to governments. When citizens stop believing their government serves them, compliance becomes voluntary. Laws are ignored, tax collection drops, corruption increases. The state continues to function in form but loses substance. This applies to any institution: schools, churches, hospitals, organizations of every kind. They all rely on something that can't be mandated or enforced: the willing participation of the people inside them. The United States military in Vietnam learned this lesson the hardest way possible. They had the finest weapons technology in the world, but their soldiers wouldn't use them. They had sophisticated tactics, but their units wouldn't execute them. They had overwhelming firepower, but their troops wouldn't fight. Because morale isn't something you add to an army. Morale is the army. Without it, you have men with guns, but you don't have soldiers. You have people wearing uniforms, but you don't have a military. The fragging epidemic was just the most visible symptom of a deeper truth. When you break trust, you break everything. When you send people to fight without explaining why it matters, they stop fighting. When you rotate them through chaos without continuity, they stop caring. When you ask them to sacrifice without purpose, they refuse. Brian Donovan lived until 2003. He never spoke publicly about his Vietnam experience during his lifetime. After his death, his family donated his papers to the Vietnam Center and archive at Texas Tech University. Among his papers was a journal written in 1972, just after he resigned. One entry, dated January 15, 1972, reads, "People ask me why we lost Vietnam. I tell them we lost it before we arrived. We lost it when we decided to fight a war our soldiers didn't believe in. We lost it when we treated men like interchangeable parts. We lost it when we measured success in body counts instead of building something worth defending. You can't win a war when your own soldiers are your enemy. And we made them our enemy by asking them to die for objectives we couldn't explain and victories that meant nothing." The United States officially withdrew from Vietnam in 1973. North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon in 1975. The war was over. But the lessons remain. They apply to every organization, every institution, every system that depends on humans to function. You can have all the technology in the world. You can have the best strategy, the most sophisticated doctrine, the clearest chain of command. But if the people executing those plans don't believe in what they're doing, you will fail. Morale isn't a bonus. It's not something you add if you have extra time and resources. It's the foundation. It's the weapon that matters most. The American military forgot that in Vietnam. 900 fragging incidents, thousands of desertions, hundreds of combat refusals, entire units that ceased to function, all because the system broke something it couldn't rebuild: trust. That's the story nobody admits, the crisis nobody wanted to document, the collapse that couldn't be acknowledged, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the most powerful military in human history had been defeated not by the enemy, but by itself. Captain Brian Donovan understood this in 1971, standing in Firebase Mackie, holding a grenade pin with his sergeant's blood on it. The war was already over. America had already lost, not to North Vietnam, to the math of human psychology. You cannot force people to care. You cannot mandate belief. You cannot order soldiers to accept death for a cause they've rejected. And when you try, they don't just stop fighting, they turn the weapons on you. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's what happens when any system breaks the morale of the people it depends on. The institutions that understand this, that invest in purpose, in cohesion, in the genuine well-being of their people, those institutions can endure extraordinary hardship. The institutions that ignore it inevitably collapse from within, no matter how powerful they appear from the outside. The United States military learned this lesson in blood and fire. 900 fragmentation grenades, 900 acts of desperation by soldiers who saw killing their leaders as the only way to survive a system that was killing them. The question is, what will it take for the rest of us to learn it?